I'm Carly.
And I'm Laurel.
I live with cerebral palsy.
And I live with a visual impairment.
I can't really walk.
And I can't really see.
So together, we're disabled as folk.
All right. Hello. Welcome to Disabled as Folk, episode number 2. Hi, Carly.
Hi, Laurel. How are ya?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
I can't believe we're on episode 2 already. This is a journey.
We made it past episode 1.
Pretty much it's smooth sailing from here. Nothing will go wrong. Everything will be great. We're pros at this point, aren't we?
Yes. Let's just put that out in the universe.
Our guest today is a fabulous artist and writer based in Regina, Saskatchewan. He's helped develop shows for the stage with Listen to Dis, Community Arts, and The Other Ordinary, or for the glorious written word with CBC, 538.com, Input, and so much more. Basically, he's everywhere. Please welcome the one and only John Loeppky.
Hi, John!
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being on. We're excited to have you. Do you want to tell us a little about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I'm a disabled theater artist and a disabled journalist based in Regina, Saskatchewan, middle of the prairies. I was born in Britain, so that inevitably comes up eventually when I talk about disability. And I also grew up in parasport playing wheelchair basketball and wheelchair rugby. So I have just a multitude of experiences, shall we say. And I'm excited to be here, so thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you again. We're excited to have you. Today's topic is about the definition of disability. So I think it might be best for us to start and maybe go around and say how we define our disability, what we like to refer to ourselves as. Carly, do you want to start that for us?
Sure. As you guys know, I also have cerebral palsy. I refer to myself as disabled, and I use identity first language in the sense of I am disabled, that is it. I don't prefer to use person first language. I am not the person that is disabled. I am just disabled because I am literally unable to do some things, not everything. As far as like language within my community, I use the word GIMP a lot to describe myself, mostly just with friends and people that know me really well, because I know that they're taking it from an angle of a joke as well. When I refer to myself within the arts community, I often use the word crip and just crip, not going as far as cripple, but like crip and crip arts is still acceptable language to me as well.
Cool. I am in much the same boat in that I use identity first language. My Twitter bio says crippled and creative. That's mostly just me so that people who email me sort of understand if they've looked at my Twitter bio anyway, understand my politics a little bit. I'm much the same in terms of, crip arts. I think and we'll get into it, but I think my approach to labels has always been, are you using the royal you, but are you using the label, or is the label using you? And so that's always my attempt to reclaim. And, I'm a pretty privileged disabled person as a white, former national team athlete, upper middle class background like that. There are reasons why I can say that word without too much fear, to be fair.
Right.
But yeah, I just try to live in that little disabled space, but also really recognize in my life that, there's a lot of code switching that ends up happening when folks want to use person first, especially living in the prairies where we don't necessarily have an understanding of disability culture all the time. Yeah. So I guess I use all of them, but for myself, it's usually identity first.
As for me, I tend to just use disabled. I've also used special needs in the past, which we can also talk about that wording. In my situation, my disability for the most part is an invisible disability. Growing up, I did have glasses. I talked about that in episode 1. So if you want to listen to that, all the fun building stories of growing up with glasses that literally could be used as doorstops was a great time. But now I have contacts and have had surgery, so I don't wear glasses anymore. So for me, a lot of folks don't even know I'm disabled. So if I were to open up about it, I do normally use the word disabled as a whole. So, on that note, you guys both brought this up, which I really like, the idea of first person disability versus disability identity. Carly, do you want to kind of explain the difference of those two to our listeners?
Speaking from my specific experience, I know that like person that is disabled and person first language is often used by professionals in the sense of like they don't want us to think that disability is all that we are when really it is to some extent, right? So if you're just trying to section it off to like be like the if you get rid of that you're an actual person, when in reality it is actually like your disability is gonna stick with you whether you like it or not come hell or high water. So I find that person first is used in that context, and disability first is used within the community more so. I'm seeing a little bit of a shift, but I think, John, you're right. When it comes to living in the prairies, it's harder to have those conversations.
I've always fallen, and part of it is the sport thing, right? Is that I've always fallen into the middle in that I use identity first language, but I also grew up in a medical family. And so that I don't always see it as cut and dry, because on a for me, I'm speaking personally for me. This isn't prescribing to anybody else. I am not a fan of the medical model, but at the same time, the ramp isn't the only thing that's getting in the lack of a ramp isn't the only thing that's getting in my way. There are days where the brain damage is pretty difficult. And I think sometimes the social model can stray occasionally. Our understanding of the social model can sometimes stray a little too far. And it's like there are just some things, like you said earlier, Carly, that you and I won't probably, I don't know you too well, but obviously, but you and I probably won't be running stand-up marathons anytime soon.
Oh, dang it, you're ruining my dream.
I know. I was gonna, yeah. Every year I'm like, I'm gonna do the QCM, the Queen City Marathon in Regina, in a handbike, and every year I get to about 3 months before, and I go, nah, those days are over. I think the social model does a pretty good job of saying like, this is we do things different ways. I just think sometimes, like, I agree with there's an academic, but he worked for the UN, the World Health Organization as well, I think, called Tom Shakespeare. His name's Tom Shakespeare. What a great name. Anyway, and he talks about sort of living in that middle space.
I was just gonna say that I think that's totally true when you grow up in a medical family as well, because my whole family is nurses and social workers and all that jazz. So I totally see where you're coming from, and it's totally valid. Because some days our brains, especially with CP, you just want to switch for like 24 hours and just have a break. So it's interesting to see people that actually are comfortable living in the world of both worlds.
Yeah, I used to joke around that I gave myself one pity party a year. I wouldn't prescribe to that idea. I think like it's a slow processing. I think I've always been, or I haven't always, I shouldn't say always. I was talking to my parents earlier today about, sort of like my relationship to identity growing up, because sometimes you have a different memory from your kid's memory, in a good way. You know, I think I've grown to the point where I try to think of it. Now, this is really holier than thou. My apologies, but I try to think of it as I can love my body without loving my symptoms. And I think that's where I try to go with the language as well. It's like whatever language gives me care. So I can go to a medical office and say, hi, I have cerebral palsy, spastic diplegia with a hint of ataxia. And yes, that sounds more like an Italian dish than anything actually useful. But if that's going to get me care, then cool, we'll put on the medical model hat. But when I go out the door and I'm advocating for other people, I got the social model. And if I'm going to the university, I mean, hell, I was and sorry, I'm taking a chance for me to speak, Laura,
Please go. We love this. Go for it. We talk too much, so we love hearing it.
but a long time ago, well, it's now called the Director of Students with Disabilities on our local student union. Somebody had made the annoying decision to change the name from whatever it was before to Director of Differently Abled Students.
Interesting.
I said, look, I understand that you're not going to want to do. I don't remember what it was before differently abled because I didn't pay attention to student politics at the time. I wasn't a journalist yet, wasn't forced to care. But I just said, like, I knew that I wasn't going to get like identity first past them, and I also knew that I was in the prairies, so not every student was going to come ready to be called a disabled student. So I said, can we change this to like director of students with disabilities, which is like basically person first. And we changed it, and that's not like a big high five. I went to one meeting and yelled for half an hour, and then they fixed it. It's not me being some big, genius, but yeah, I think it's just being mindful of space. I think a lot of times, like I know lots of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who prefer person first because they're tired of the medicalized lens, and as far away as we can get from it is good. And I think I saw a tweet today, and I'm not going to say from who. They were complaining about Carla Qualtrough had put out a tweet that the minister of women and disabilities and something else.
Yeah, women, disabilities, and possibly sports or employment.
Yeah, I can't remember. Anyway, Carla Qualtrough had put out this tweet, and some of their wording was those experiencing disability. And this person was like, oh, we're at it with this language, except that in the prairies, I actually hear that quite often from some like disability support organizations and folks in community, as we muddle through what person first and identity and what the middle is. I saw that they put out this tweet. I was like, how do we manage a group of people who like disability isn't a monolith? So how can we expect this like identity first or whatever term we prefer to reign supreme when the experiences of somebody in Edmonton is different from somebody who's in Regina, who's different from Nova Scotia, who's different from Newfoundland, and I think that comes back to the lack of understanding that I think we've built even inside the disability community about what other people in other provinces face. I couldn't tell you the intricacies of AISH. Um, I know some of the intricacies of ODSP, or just through research and stuff, or I wrote an article about SED, so I understand some.
I think that's a really good point, John, because I know from my perspective, for example, to be totally forthcoming, I am not as present in the disabled community as I would like to be. A lot of that, once again, stems from, like I said at the top, is that a lot of people in my life don't even know that I have a disability. So this podcast is going to be a surprise for some of them. So if you don't know, hello, friends, I am disabled. Surprise. And so
We should throw you a party.
I know. When COVID is over, if you're in town, come on down. we'll have a party.
Yeah, the like I'm disabled party.
So yeah, so I'm not so out in that regard. So I'm kind of to your point where different provinces may have different ways of referring to disabled individuals. I kind of feel the same where I'm still kind of learning how to refer to people or how people like to be referred to. So I think that's a very interesting point that different provinces and different areas of Canada might have different ways of referring to disabled people. So that's really interesting. Do you guys have a particular maybe label or I don't want to say saying, but something that kind of irks you where you kind of go, "Ooh, I don't really like that one," or are you kind of open to any type of?
I would say a big one for me is differently abled.
Yeah.
Like, I don't, like, at the end of the day, I'm just gonna figure out how to do stuff. And it's gonna take me longer to figure out how to do it, but just because I, can't do something doesn't mean I do everything I do weirdly. And that's why I prescribe to the word disabled, because it's literally like unable to do something. And that's it, right? Like, differently able, I feel like, is a bunch of people trying to be allies and trying to be like, well, I don't really want to call you out, but this is the word I've come up with, right? So that one irks me a lot. Crip, I've kind of lived with and sat with for a while. If the word cripple is coming out of like a different generation's mouth, then I have an issue with that. But if it's, again, within the arts community that I'm fairly deep into, it comes from a different angle, right? So those are my two red flags. John?
I have, to be fully transparent, I have non-disabled friends who, when I
Yep.
stand up in public places, will yell out "It's a miracle" as a joke,
Right.
uh, and like I don't care. But again, it's recognizing that that's because I have that relationship with those people, and I think that can sometimes get lost in translation almost. Just because I feel okay with you two calling me a cripple doesn't mean that I'm okay with um, it doesn't mean that I'm okay with just like anybody. I saw a tweet from Jason Dorbert, who's a disabled theater professor in the States, and he said, I don't think anybody, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I don't think anybody should be allowed to use the word cripple if they haven't had it yelled at them down a street. And I was like, well, that's an interesting thing to think about and sit with. Yeah, for me, I'm not a fan of differently abled. My personal favorite was a time an educator when I was in high school came up to me and said that I knew that they were doing some professional development, and I had an inkling that it was around disability. Anyway, this person came up to me and said, "For this class, I need to interview somebody." I said, "Okay." And said, "I need to interview somebody with an exceptionality." And I said, "What's that?"
Oh
Oh no!
no.
Oh
I was like,
Oh
"What's
no!
that?"
no.
And I honestly thought, naively, I thought they were gonna be like, I thought they meant like, you're a disabled athlete, like something that like I thought they meant like some skill that maybe is perceived as not being something that somebody who looks like me has. I said, you can just say disability, right? And it was like, okay, but and differently able comes from the same space. It's often a bunch of non-disabled or parents of disabled kids who feel uncomfortable with the word disability. I mean, I hasten to bet that a lot of disabled people, particularly I think in the arts, but people who have, should we say, publicly facing experiences of disability, have people. I've certainly had people say, "I'll say I'm disabled," and you'll get like, "I don't like that word," from a non-disabled person. You'd be like, "Right, but that's not my burden to carry. That's yours to figure out with somebody else." And I think that's where the differently abled thing comes in. If another disabled person wants to identify as differently abled, cool. Because
Mm-hmm.
if they come from an institutionalized model and they really want to reclaim that they have abilities that aren't understood, cool. But I don't think another disabled person identifying as differently abled, and I know that's not what we're saying here, but I don't think that that's harmful to the community. It's when we're prescribed and, like we're always are, told how we're supposed to identify, how we're supposed to move, how we're supposed to be as, I, um, reclaimed language alert, cut this if you want, but, I've written multiple times in essays, sometimes the approach of the public, the non-disabled public, especially in the prairies, is if you have to be crippled, can you at least be quiet? And I think you haven't known me very long, but I think you can imagine that I'm not very good at that last part. I'm not particularly quiet.
Mm.
Yeah, same.
I just don't have any different an experience than the one that I was living in and born with, and so, you know, and I come from parasport, which is like the most politically incorrect space of disabled people. They make artists look like prudes. It's really just, oh, what disability does that guy have? Oh, well, that one's a spastic, and that one, and it's just like that was the language that I grew up with at a certain point, and so obviously I don't use that as much, except in certain company, but it does lead me to this space where I'm not as interested in the word as I am the meaning behind the word.
Yeah, that's true.
My favorite, and if someone relates to this phrase, I do apologize. It's your choice to do that, to relate to this. But my favorite is specially abled. I love it because I feel like laser beams are gonna come out of my eyes, or like Thor and the Avengers are gonna gather around anytime I walk into a room. Like specially able to me is kind of a way of making a disability sound better. And I'm not sure who that language is for, whether that is for a non-disabled person, or is it a way to make it seem, because I think the word disability is a heavy word for some folks, right? I think it can carry a lot of weight if you don't really know what it is like to live with a disability. Because the reality is a lot of folks with disabilities, most of them at least, were born that way, right? So we don't know any other way of living other than how we were born. So I think that that's something that is interesting to think about and to bring up is that mentality of what language are we using? Is it for ourselves or is it for others? But I really like specially abled because I feel like I have a superpower and I'm going to take over the world with my special abilities that are actually just me not being able to read a menu in a restaurant and having to go to the bathroom, or me getting on the wrong bus because I can't read the numbers. Like that is not a special power. That is just my life.
Every time I heard like specially abled or special needs or whatever iteration of that you want to hear, I always imagine that I wish I could have been Inspector Gadget and just been like, go Gadget legs, or go Gadget no spastic, or like something like that.
I just love, was that he had a trench coat, right? I also love that vibe for you. Just a beautiful brown khaki trench coat moment that you are just whipping surprises. You just got your arms, your legs, your whatever. I love that. I think that's great.
Right? Like, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been, I didn't do this as a kid, and then I went to university and less people used the word special needs, thank goodness.
Yep.
But, you always wish you could go back and what would you tell yourself? And I wish I'd just turn around and go, could you explain to me what that means? Could you explain to me like what is so special about my abilities? And like inevitably it comes back to you're able to get out of bed and not look depressed all the time. That's what it boils like. You look reasonably normal for somebody with brain damage. That's all special needs really means through most people's, unless it's being used as reclaimed or funny or yeah, I keep saying. I mean, it's in my. I'm still working on my MFA endlessly, but it's like, oh, somebody asked me what the difficult part about my MFA was, and I said, well, every time something funny happens to me, I have to fight the urge to put it in the script. It's just like that's the only ability it's given me. It's given me funny stories at parties.
Yeah, I feel like, and this might be self-deprecating, but I am not special to the listeners that are listening. I am a perfectly average human being. I just happen to not see well. So if you would like to refer to me as special, I appreciate that. It's a kind thing, but I am not. I am just a regular person, a solid 7 trying to get through life. So yeah, I think special is just a very I don't want to say touchy, but a unique way of referring to folks with disabilities because, yeah, I don't know. I think it's interesting terms, but
yeah, it's like the inspiration narrative, right? And the idea of the super crip or inspiration porn, and as always, thanks to the late Still Young for giving us the language for a lot of this stuff. But it's like from an athlete when I was an athlete, and I always say I got to go to some cool stuff, but never anything important. It's like people would, oh, you're so inspiring, and I used to say to people like, inspiring for what? Because like I don't mind being inspiring in terms of wow, that person can really move their chair. Like wow, I want to be an athlete like them. But often it reverts back to if I was you, I wouldn't be able to get out of bed. Yeah, cool, your problem. In a certain sense. Like I hold space for you, but also like that's a really weird thing to say to me wheeling down the street.
My friends used to call me Hawkeye, which was one of my favorites. And then ironically, it happened to me once in school where I didn't necessarily tell everybody. Like I was always that kid that was front row, so therefore there was this perception of me of being like a nerd or a keener, which was super unfortunate because I was neither of those things. But I had to sit front row because I couldn't see further back. So unfortunately, I had to maintain a high GPA for most of my life. Just kidding. I'm average at best. But I remember there was one time a teacher who didn't know about my disability was teaching a lesson, and they did this thing where they like would put a bunch of like I forget what his teaching style was, but he put a bunch of weird crap on the board, and you had to find stuff, and then you get candy, or like he had a very unique way of teaching. And anyway, he was talking about, it's probably math or some boring subject I was not listening to, and I spotted the thing that he was talking about. I'm like, oh, it's right there. And then he goes, oh wow, you're quite the Hawkeye, aren't you? And then my friends who knew about my disability loved it and ran with it through pretty much all of my high school years. So it was like, here comes Hawkeye, everyone be prepared. And I love that. I've been very fortunate that my humor, I think, is perhaps at times arguably inappropriate. Like, very few things bother me. If you call me certain words, I think for me it's a matter of the context in which they're said. So if you're trying to say it to me to clearly hurt me, that's a different episode. That would be our bullying episode that we talked about in episode 1. But I don't get offended easily, if that makes sense. So for me, in regards to nicknames or anything like that, it takes a lot to kind of get under my skin. But that being said, I am fortunate in regards to the fact that my disability isn't as outward, right? So the individuals that are saying these nicknames or these, funny phrases to me already know about my disability because I've chosen to let them in to that part of my life. So I do understand that I have some privilege there where a lot of that quote unquote inappropriate or negative connotations disability wise, I kind of already have established for myself with their friendship. So that's something that I've been able to navigate in that way.
Yeah, I think it's always tough with dark disability humor when like, I say this sort of tongue in cheek, but around the sort of bullying and the the perception of disability and how I'm viewed in some spaces, it's sort of like, have I processed that trauma yet or not?
Right. Yeah.
You know, like, I don't know. Like, sure, I can remember things from when I was in school that were, as in high school, elementary school, whatever, that were gross. I keep joking that I'm going to do a performance art piece where I hand the new president of the University of Regina an itemized list of human rights violations and the costs thereof. But it's also just like,
Can I join you on that, John? Because that sounds amazing.
yeah, we could all do it. I was actually inspired by an artist who I've since interviewed, but her name's Katie Haleo, and she's from Minneapolis. Anyway, she came and did a presentation and a piece at the University of Regina, and it's about being an adoptee and going through the process of medical exploration, medical. And anyway, in this play, she walks around tearing up her medical notes. Anyway, point being, in a circular way, that how I think we all process things. I mean, what a generalization. We all process things differently. Wow, what a
crazy concept.
what an amazing thing to think. Not. Yeah, but it's just like, I think that humor can hurt more than it can help.
Yep.
If the humor is just the survival instinct.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that that's something I wish I understood as a younger disabled person, because I've been making the same jokes that people think are dark, and I'm about to turn 28. That's reasonably screwed up that I'm making the same jokes when I was 11 than I am when I'm 28. And
yeah, I think I agree with you. Because it can become at some point kind of, and I don't want to speak on behalf of you, but I'm the same way. I used humor to cope with a lot of, I think, trauma that maybe I haven't unpacked, which, you know what, we'll figure that out.
Exactly.
But I think it's kind of become almost a coping mechanism, right? Because if you can deflect it onto yourself, it's, I think, maybe easier for other people. Because if you're like, oh yeah, no, it's funny, I can't see, isn't it? Because it's an easier way to deflect difficult questions, right? And difficult things to talk about. So yeah, I'm with you on that. Did you ever find that, Carly? Did you ever kind of deflect things maybe with humor or with self-deprecating words?
Sure did, and still I'm exactly like John. I used the same jokes when I was 10 versus now that I'm 30, and it just comes down to like what really is my trauma. We're all gonna sound like a broken record here, but like I think
And then we cut to, we are sponsored by, but we do not have a sponsor. Exactly.
We are sponsored by Trauma.
Trauma, it's free and lasts forever.
but I think trauma is something that like I'm just now kind of digging into and realizing that like medical trauma definitely does exist and how I've coped with it in the past. Maybe not the greatest, but also like I can't sit here all day every day and hate my life.
Yeah.
Like I gotta throw something into it. And I think people assume that because I sit in a chair that I do hate my life. When in reality, I've got like the best friends, the best work, the best pieces of art. Like I've actually built a life for myself that I'm really proud of and that I really want to show to the rest of the world.
Carly, that is crazy. Disabled people cannot live a life.
I know, right?
I feel like we might need to edit this out because you're going to confuse a lot of people with that statement. I just want to repeat, you have a job?
Yeah.
You have a job.
It's like this whole new concept.
Wow.
Multiple jobs, in fact.
Crazy concept. Wow. And John, you also have a job, correct?
I do have multiple jobs.
Wow.
Yes.
Look at that. Wow.
Yeah.
We're breaking boundaries here.
I think that like it comes back to that identity and that language piece, right? It's like we often use humor to cope and to process, but also like, sure, we all happen to use identity first language. But if you've grown up in small town Saskatchewan being called handicapped for your whole life, I can totally see how person first is like a giant step up. And so I think we need to be really mindful as a community of how we welcome younger disabled people into the language. And like there's different subcultures within that, right? Like, you probably wouldn't find somebody with cerebral palsy using the term impaired, but you're likely to find, I don't want to speak for your experience, Laurel, but you're more likely to find people using the term visually impaired than you are in the physically disabled community. I don't think I'm telling tales out of school to say that. And that's cool. And we don't need to. Sometimes it can feel around language like I jokingly call it the disability name game. Like, what if the ableds decided they're comfortable with this week? And then how have we responded to that? And then what infighting has that created? And in a lot of ways, I think that infighting, oh God, way to make me sound real socialist, but I think infighting in a community like the disability community is a tool of the oppressor. Get them arguing with each other, and then we don't have to give them rights because they're all worried about what word it is that day. And anything that we can do to really meet people, like I saw it recently, the Associated Press style guide, so the style guide for American journalism, put out this thing that was like, we recognize that identity first and person first is a thing. We think that you should default to person first in a group of people or where somebody hasn't told you their preference. And it was a really fruitful discussion on Twitter because they're taking that from, there's a disability style guide from the Walter Cronkite School at the University of, it's either Arizona or Arizona State. And that's what that one says. But then a bunch of autistic people came in and said, well, actually, we don't really feel comfortable in the same way that other communities might feel being person first, because person first is used, is the tool of ABA and parents of autistic kids that want to deny the existence of their disability. And you get this really fruitful conversation. But where I get scared is when the conversation stops there. I used to very dark in advocacy meetings and stuff. They'd be like, what word do you like to use? And I used to say, you can call me cripple every day of my life if you can guarantee my whole community's human rights. Now, a bit of an empty threat because that's not going to happen. And that's a bit of hand wavium, junk. But it's sort of like, I don't want to say that words don't matter. Obviously, I mean, I have an English degree. I'm a journalist. Words really matter, but words are in concert with action, and I think too often we get really split. An incremental move forward is a move forward, and I think in Canada we get very tied into what, and this is not to speak ill of the advocates that are in these spaces, but I think we get very tied into what acceptable advocacy is in Toronto and Vancouver versus what that means in even Edmonton and Regina. There are things that I can say on stage in Toronto I can't say here. I don't mean in a theater sense. I mean like if I'm going up to make an argument, you know. And I think that's just it's the reality of our community.
Yeah, I noticed that a lot. I got a chance to go to Ottawa in 2016 to help build the Accessible Canada Act, or whatever they're calling it these days. And I noticed that hugely between Alberta and Ontario, because those were the folks that I hung out with. But I was just like, why are we spending so much time talking about debating the smaller things when really we haven't even gotten to why we're here and what we're trying to fix, which evidently came out 3 years later when it was passed, when I can guarantee you that 80% of what we thought was fruitful conversation was completely lumped into one little small little section of this act, and we didn't actually accomplish what we needed to because we kept getting caught up on the small things.
Yeah, I think the Accessible Canada Act and acts like it, I think it's often work like that is not the work of advocates, but the I mean we see it with that big committee, right? Where half of the committee for the accessibility is like parents of disabled people, and I'm not thinking, I have two parents who are parents of disabled people, but again, it's policy led by comfort of non-disabled people, and I don't think that always translates. And then the disabled people, and I look like the bog standard disabled person that gets dragged into to like be interviewed about the disabled experience because I have the privilege of being in this space, right? And yeah, I think it's really challenging to break that down inside community and outside. And again, it is all rooted in the language that we feel comfortable with. I feel really well. Okay, can I give you a funny story to illustrate this?
Yes,
Yes,
please.
please.
Yeah.
So I got an award. I won't say what organization. I'll tell you after the podcast. But I got an award, and basically it was like a disability leadership award. I was given this award, and I was in a chair, and I'm ambulatory, and so when they announced that I was getting this award in the space, I stood up to accept the award because I thought it would be funny. So I stood up and I walked over to get the award. And, normally they're whispering congratulations in the ear. The person who was presenting me the award just kept whispering, "Are you okay?"
Hmm.
I think which is to say, which was pretty funny. And then I sat back down. It's really hard, I think, when we view activism particularly as, I think there's still a bias towards what I would call boots on the ground activism, when I think so many disabled advocates, as I identify with, are much more likely to be what I call boardroom advocates. As in, we're going to Ottawa, we're having these conversations, we're going to the UN, we're doing these discussions, as opposed to we're standing outside with a sign, physical action because of the safety concerns of being in physical proximity to people like police. Let's not pretend. But then when you get pulled into these processes, I think it's really hard to feel like no matter who you are or what you're doing, like you're representing the community properly. Because like disability is not a monolith. My concerns are different from huge concerns. I mean, look at how white disability advocacy is. It is like painfully white.
Yeah.
And there are privileged reasons for that, and then that leads to the same perpetuation of the same things, and we're working towards that, I think. particularly a lot of the Black Lives Matter work and Twitter advocacy that I won't say bridges that gap, but really brings in the non-white disabled experience. But at the same time, I mean, if you ask people who are the two disability heroes in Canada, they will answer Rick Hansen and Terry Fox.
Yep.
And those are our perceptions. I'm not talking about from a race perspective. I'm saying from an overall sort of body-mind perspective, that's our conception of disability, and that hasn't changed in 40 years.
And I think that, like, people don't even realize that a disability like CP is completely different. Your experience with it is going to be different than mine. And so I think opening the idea of, like, a spectrum in general for all of different disabilities needs to happen before anything else happens. But unfortunately, that's not the order of events. Usually, it's folks that think they're being really good allies, but they aren't, wanting to start us off as a baseline and then going from there.
Yeah, and I think the language part also really comes in. It's kind of my last point in that. Obviously, depending on your disability, but for me, the oldest person I know with my disability is 58, and CP is like the second most common brain injury from birth. Like, we are not that far away from yay for me being cheery. We're not that far away from like a leave them on the doorstep eugenical perspective when it comes to our disability. So unlike some other communities, we don't have the same it's funny I use the term because it's a business term, institutional memory. I don't think we have the same conceptions of language because we still often have to pull from the heroes who survived the horrors as opposed to the wider community. And, we see that all the time in medical ableism where, I had teammates where they were being treated for things and it was like, well, this is the first time we've had anybody like you. And this is the first time that anybody like you, with cancer and things like that. So we're guessing because there just isn't this history of that, and I think that ties right back into language a lot, and the language that we use to bring it back together, that the language that we use to discuss our trauma or discuss our disability or discuss, like, there was recently an article that I would say says something that a lot of folks with CP probably know already, which is that there was a study about how anxiety is more likely for those with cerebral palsy, anxiety and depression disorders. And, I think I'm obviously not speaking for you, Carla, but I think a lot of people in my CP circle, if I could call it that, we're just looking at it like silently nodding, like, duh. But we're now proving that in 2021.
I legitimately just wrote a paper on that. Yep.
Cheery.
I had a good chuckle about that.
Yeah, it's like I often make fun of, well, I sometimes make fun of, studies that are like the U of R once funded, I think it was the U of R, funded a whole science, and I'm pro science, I should say, but, do we really need a study on the sex habits of mice? Like, we know that they make a lot of mice. Yeah. But then you get to these things where you're like, I thought we understood that, and then you go into the research and you're like, oh, we don't, yeah. But that's so many conditions.
I'm stoked for this. Well, nearing the end of our podcast. So, John, we like to end it with asking, what is your biggest disabled as folk moment? So this moment can be your biggest triumph or epic fail while living life with a disability.
Okay, well, it's going to be the latter, which the listeners probably predicted the moment I opened my mouth. And I may be conflating two events in my brain because they may not have happened on the same day, but it's funnier if they're in connection. And you know what? It was a decade ago, so we're just going to half trust my memory. So, yeah, I got to play wheelchair basketball for Team Saskatchewan and Team Canada for a little bit, but I went to the 2011 Canada Games in Halifax, and we used to do this thing in wheelchair basketball called CP races, where you would get, because most of them in basketball are ambulatory, so you would get all of the kids with CP, and you would line them up, and you would have a race. And you always did the race in a very public place, so you had as much people, able-bodied people, horrified as possible. Anyway, before this tournament, our lovely coach said, yeah, maybe that's not a good look on like a national stage. Like maybe we could not do that. And us being, whatever youthful fools, said, well, we'll find some other way to do it, right? This was kind of the agreement across the country. And I won't say who I did this with, but there was a little games area, and they had Just Dance and Dance Dance Revolution. So we decided, well, we're not allowed to do a CP race, but nobody told us we couldn't do a CP dance off. So now you've got to imagine that most of the kids with CP who were playing at the time were not, like most of us had leg and arm involvement. Like we were not like looking at us, you knew what was going on kind of thing, right? It was not like we couldn't pass as able-bodied, I guess is what I'm saying. So there is a video living somewhere on somebody's cell phone of me and a friend dancing, and there's like 20 disabled people killing themselves laughing, and then like 100 non-disabled kids, right? Because like Canada Games is under 24 and under, watching, trying to figure out if they're allowed to laugh, because we're both terrible, as you can imagine. I gave up and sat on the ground and started punching numbers. The other guy was like trying harder. We're done this, and I know I'm going to get in trouble from my coach, so whatever. So then you go up, and to get to where the dining hall was, you have to go on 2 elevators. And like earlier in the day, we played, and I had learned as a child in Britain how to take an escalator in a wheelchair. Disabled listeners can probably already predict where this is going to go. So I was like, you know what? I've taken the 2 elevators that take a really long time because there's so many people. I'm going to take the escalator. So I take the escalator, and I get halfway up, and I've never had this spasm before or since. Both of my arms go, and I go, I can't think of anything except, let's just say I fall. And I fall pretty spectacularly, and my wheelchair falls all the way down this really long mall escalator. Thankfully, nobody was behind me. And then I get to the bottom, and my pants and my butt get stuck in like the feeder for the escalator. So now my teammates are all laughing at me. I know I'm going to get yelled at because like this was a ridiculous thing to do, right? Like, this is not safe. I shouldn't have done it. I was also 17. Right? So I'm sitting there, my legs are spasming because my brain is like, what did our owner do? I don't understand. And then one of the athletes from another team, definitely not wheelchair basketball, just like picked me up and then like grabbed my chair and deposited me in it. So I go up the elevator, and of course, like the message has been relayed to my coach. It is important to note that this coach was in a wheelchair, and so not only could he yell at me as a coach, it would also be like, "You're embarrassing all of us," kind of me. Like I'm also like an able-bodied coach, I would say, can't yell at you in the same way that like a friend with CP can say something like, "Why did you think that was a good idea?" in a way that a non-disabled person probably can't, because they have some of the same, whatever. They have some inkling. So then I proceeded to get screamed at in front of 750 people who were all getting food. Rightfully so. You shouldn't have done that. That's really dangerous, because my chair could have hit somebody, and like at that height, at that speed, would not have been fun. You know what happens if because some of the teams there were as young as 13. What happens if my big titanium chair smacks a little kid in the face? Like, that's not good. That's kind of a violation of the athlete code of conduct. So yeah, we won the game. I played a CP dance off, and then I fell down an escalator.
Well, that's great. Now I want to go out and party with you, John, because I think it'd be so much fun.
That sounds like a very eventful time.
Oh God, I'm. Oh yeah, yeah. I don't think. I don't think that was my best decision I've ever made.
Well, thank you, John. That was an awesome story. That is, you like I read it with Carly. You sound like a blast. 17-year-old even now. That's I love that.
I think it's fair to say I've calmed down since then.
So no escalators for you.
No, I haven't gone. I don't think I've gone on an escalator since.
Right. Thank you, John, for that great story. That was awesome. For our listeners, where can they find you? What are you up to? We would love to give them more information.
Sure. So my day job, I'm a lead programmer with Listen to Dis Community Arts, which is Saskatchewan's only disability-led disability arts organization. So I do a little bit of I just I do lead programming and administrative assistance. And then I'm a freelance journalist. I'll leave the portfolio link for somebody to put in the show notes. But yeah, I'm findable on Twitter. I'll just leave the Twitter handle because I ridiculously made my Twitter handle in 3 languages, so that's really helpful. My family's Welsh, so it's Cymru, which is the Welsh word for Wales, which is CYMRU _ET for and in French. Even though I don't speak French, this is what you do when you're like 16 and get a Twitter account. And then _Canada, which is kind of where I yell the most, is on Twitter. So yeah, so there's journalism to read, there's theater to watch, there's I don't know, listeners can send me emails, hopefully positive ones, but I'll take the negative ones too.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, John, for coming on. It was great to have you. We sparked some awesome discussions. Hopefully we can have you on again, but yeah, thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, John.
You're very welcome.
First guest. Woo! Disabled as Folk is possible thanks to support from TELUS STORYHIVE, the National Screen Institute, and Dave Shumka. This podcast was developed by us, Carly Neese and Laurel Carter.
Our producer is Mac Brock, with sound editing and music by Mustafa Rafiq, with music support from Ethan Bookma. For updates and exclusive content, you can find us on Instagram at DisabledAsFolk. Thanks for listening.
This program was produced with the support of TELUS.